You'll never be anything without me, Michael said, his voice sharp with the particular cruelty that comes from intimacy. You don't have the skills. You don't have the connections. You don't have the intelligence. Without me, you're nothing. You'll regret this decision forever. I'd listened to him say this while packing my suitcase, my hand steady despite the fear that was consuming me. But 5 years later, when Forbes magazine featured me as a self-made millionaire, and Michael read that article and reached out to congratulate me, I realized something fundamental. He didn't understand that I'd already become everything without him. My name is Alexandra Mitchell. I'm 34 years old. And the dream house that my ex-boyfriend always wanted to own is now mine, purchased with money I earned entirely on my own, in a life I built after leaving him. The relationship with Michael had lasted 7 years. 7 years of slow erosion. 7 years of believing less and less in myself while he positioned himself as the essential ingredient in whatever success I might eventually achieve. It had started subtly. Michael was charming, successful, confident. He was a lawyer with a prestigious firm. He had money, connections, a life that looked enviable from the outside. When we'd first gotten together, I'd been working as a graphic designer at a mid-size marketing firm. I'd been competent at my job. I'd had my own apartment. I'd been independent. But Michael had had opinions about all of that. Graphic design isn't really a real profession, he'd say casually. It's not like law. It doesn't have the same intellectual rigor. You should work at a bigger firm, he'd suggest. Your current company is basically a startup. They don't have prestige. You're not dressing professionally enough for someone in your position, he'd comment. Let me buy you some better clothes. Each comment, taken individually, wasn't abusive. But together, over years, they'd formed a narrative. I wasn't quite good enough. I wasn't quite smart enough. I wasn't quite competent enough. But Michael was all of those things, and as long as I stayed with him, as long as I accepted his guidance, I could be associated with his success. By year 5 of the relationship, I'd moved into his house. I'd quit my job to focus on being a partner. I stopped seeing my friends regularly because Michael's schedule was demanding and he preferred to spend evenings alone with me. I stopped pursuing my own projects because Michael had convinced me that freelance design work was beneath me, even though it also meant I had no income and no professional identity outside of being Michael's girlfriend. I'd become entirely financially dependent on him. Entirely emotionally dependent on him. Entirely defined by my relationship to him. And I'd believed, at least partly, that I couldn't survive without him. The breakdown came in year 7. Michael had been having an affair. I'd found out by accident, a text message on his phone, a photo that wasn't meant for me. When I'd confronted him, he hadn't denied it. But he'd also hadn't apologized. You drove me to this, he'd said coldly. You're not enough for me. You're not interesting enough. You're not accomplished enough. You don't make me feel anything anymore. I needed someone who could actually keep up with me intellectually. I'd sat on our couch and had felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak. Clarity. All the years of being told I wasn't enough. All the years of accepting his narrative about my inadequacy. All the years of shrinking myself to fit into the space he'd allocated for me. And even after all of that, even after I'd given up my career, my independence, my sense of self, it still wasn't enough. Because the problem had never been me. The problem had been him. The problem had been that he needed someone to be less than him in order to feel superior. He needed someone to believe they were nothing without him. And I'd finally stopped believing that. Leaving was terrifying. I had $1,200 in a savings account. I had no job. I had no apartment. I had one suitcase of belongings. Michael had said all the things I'd expected him to say. You'll regret this. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. You'll be back within a month. You'll never survive without me. And then, finally, the cruelty, you'll never be anything without me. You don't have what it takes to succeed on your own. Good luck failing on your own. I'd stayed silent. I'd taken my suitcase and had walked out of the door. The first year after leaving Michael was about raw survival. I'd stayed with a close friend for a month while I figured out how to rebuild my life from nothing. I'd needed to find an apartment I could afford on a single income. I'd needed to find work that would pay me enough to live. I'd needed to rebuild the confidence that 7 years with Michael had systematically dismantled. But I'd also needed to remember who I was when I wasn't defined by him. Who I'd been before he convinced me that I was nothing without him. I'd started small and deliberately. I'd volunteered to completely redesign the website for the nonprofit organization my friend worked for, using that project to rebuild my portfolio. I'd posted some of my old design work on social media, reconnecting with the creative community I'd abandoned. I'd reached out to former colleagues to let them know I was available for freelance projects and ready to work. The work had started coming in slowly at first. One small project led to another. One satisfied client led to 3 more referrals. My portfolio grew. My reputation grew. Most importantly, my confidence grew. By the end of year 2 of being single, I'd been making enough from freelance design work to not just survive, but to support myself comfortably. I'd moved into my own one-bedroom apartment. I'd rebuilt my savings. I'd started to believe in my own capability again. By the end of year 3 after leaving Michael, I'd been approached by a tech startup that wanted me to lead their entire design department. It was a significant opportunity. They wanted someone to build design strategy from scratch, to create a design team, to establish visual identity for a brand new product. I'd negotiated aggressively for that position. I'd asked for a competitive salary. I'd requested equity in the company. I'd insisted on the ability to build and lead a design team. Michael had never taught me how to negotiate assertively on my own behalf. I'd learned that skill entirely on my own, through reading, through taking courses, through observing other women who negotiated successfully. I'd learned it because I had to. Because no one was going to advocate for me except myself. The startup had been my breakthrough. We'd launched a software product that solved a genuine, widespread problem in project management for creative teams. The product had become incredibly successful, resonating with companies across the tech, advertising, and design industries. The company had grown rapidly from 15 employees when I joined to 200 employees by year 4. We'd expanded into multiple markets. We'd been approached by larger software companies about acquisition opportunities. By year 4 after leaving Michael, the company had been acquired for $180 million. My equity stake, which had been significant because I'd negotiated well for equity compensation from the beginning, had been worth approximately $23 million before taxes and capital gains. After taxes and strategic investments guided by competent financial advisors, I'd had roughly $14 million in liquid assets. I'd become a self-made millionaire. Not because of anyone else's guidance. Not because of anyone else's connections. Not because of inherited wealth or investor backing. But because I'd worked relentlessly. I'd learned constantly. I'd taken calculated risks. I believed in myself when no one else did, especially when the person closest to me had told me I was nothing without him. When Forbes reached out about featuring me in their Self-Made Millionaires Under 35 issue, I said yes immediately. This was a story I wanted told. Not for vindication, but because I knew other people, particularly women, who needed to hear that it was possible to rebuild after emotional abuse. That you could lose everything and still build something extraordinary. The article had been extensive and well-researched. The journalists had interviewed me at length about my journey. They discussed the startup's success and my specific role in creating its design strategy. They'd talked about my philosophy for building creative teams. They'd highlighted that I'd built this entirely on my own, without investor backing or family wealth. They'd quoted me talking about how leaving the relationship had been the pivotal moment when everything changed. The article had been published on a Friday morning and immediately went viral in design and startup circles. Michael had called me on Saturday afternoon. "Alexandra," he'd said, his voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard in 5 years. "I saw the Forbes article. I wanted to reach out and congratulate you. That's an incredible achievement. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I always knew you had potential. I'm glad you finally figured out how to access it." I'd listened to him claim credit for my success, claim insight into my potential, reframe his abuse as if it had somehow been mentoring. And I'd made a choice. I decided not to correct him. I decided not to tell him that his belief in my potential had actually been an obstacle. I decided not to engage with him at all, except for one statement. "Thanks," I'd said. "I just bought that beach house you always dreamed about. You know, the $8 million one in Malibu? It's beautiful. The sunsets are incredible. I'm really enjoying it." There had been silence on the other end of the line. "That's..." Michael had started. "Wonderful?" I'd finished. "Yes, it is. I'm very happy. Goodbye, Michael." I'd hung up before he could respond. I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it to close a door. To mark, definitively, that there was no world in which his approval mattered. That there was no version of my success in which he played a role. He'd always talked about buying that Malibu beach house. It had been his dream. He described it in detail 100 times. The exact location. The view. The architectural details. It had represented everything he aspired to: wealth, status, success. And I'd bought it. Not to make him jealous. But to demonstrate, clearly, that I had transcended the world he'd tried to keep me trapped in. The $8 million Malibu house has been one of my best purchases. Not because of what it cost, but because of what it represents. It's a place where I write. Where I design. Where I think. Where I remember exactly how much I'm capable of achieving when I'm not compromised by someone else's need to diminish me. I've built a career after my initial startup success. I founded my own design consulting firm. I've mentored younger designers, particularly women who've experienced similar confidence erosion in relationships or workplaces. I've spoken at conferences about overcoming self-doubt and rebuilding after trauma. My net worth is now approximately $47 million. Not because I was driven by ambition to prove something to Michael, but because once I stopped listening to his narrative about my inadequacy, I'd been able to access my actual potential. That's the thing about emotional abuse. It's so effective because it's gaslighting disguised as love. It's someone telling you that they're hurting you for your own good. That their criticism is actually mentoring. That their control is actually protection. And the person being abused often doesn't realize, until they leave, how much of their own potential they've been suppressing. How much of their own voice they've been silencing. How much of their own power they've been giving away. Michael has tried to reach out several times since that phone call about the Malibu house. He sent emails congratulating me on various business achievements. He's tried to reposition himself as someone who always saw my potential and was just waiting for me to realize it myself. He suggested that we should reconnect, that perhaps we could have lunch and talk about old times. He's tried to insert himself back into my narrative as some kind of positive influence. I haven't responded to any of it. Because there's absolutely nothing he can offer me. There's no validation from him that matters anymore. There's no approval from him that I need. There's no role for him to play in my life except as a cautionary tale about what emotional abuse looks like when it's disguised as mentorship. The people who matter in my life now are the ones who believed in me when I had nothing. Who saw potential in me when I was broken and terrified. Who offered friendship and support without conditions or expectations of payment. Who celebrated my success without claiming credit for it. Michael is not one of those people. I think about the version of me that believed his narrative. The version of me that thought I was nothing without him. The version of me that had accepted his criticism as fundamental truth about my capabilities and my worth. And I feel profound gratitude that I left. Not just for the money or the career success, though those are nice. But for the ability to know myself. To trust myself. To understand that my potential existed independent of his validation. To recognize that my fear was his leverage, and once I stopped being afraid, he had nothing. He said I'd regret leaving him. That I'd fail without him. That I'd never be anything without his guidance. He was wrong about all of it. I'm not just something without him. I'm everything I always could have been. I'm everything I always was, underneath the years of him telling me I was less. And the best part? He has to live with the knowledge that I achieved all of this in spite of him, not because of him. That his presence in my life was actually an obstacle, not an asset. The Malibu house sits on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Every morning, I wake up to that view. Every evening, I watch the sun set over the water. I have friends over. I host dinner parties. I write. I design. I create. I live in the space that he wanted but could never attain. And every time I'm there, I remember, this is what's possible when you believe in yourself more than you believe in someone else's narrative about your limitations. This is what's possible when you leave. This is what's possible when you realize you were never nothing. You were just waiting for the space to become everything.